Just a few housekeeping things before Howard starts his talk. This is our third year with First Wednesdays, and it's a Vermont Humanities Council program. It's being done in about 7 other areas of the state, but we're the only one here in the South, Manchester. They just started. I'd like to thank our donors who make this series possible, and that's the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library, and that's an organization you can all join if you care for. There's a newsletter on the table there, and they help support us with extra things like these programs. Entergy Vermont, Brattleboro Savings and Loan Association, and Merrill Lynch of Brattleboro all have contributed to this series. And our statewide sponsor this year is the Vermont Department of Libraries. The next First Wednesday's program will be December 5th, and Dartmouth College of Religion professor Susan Ackerman will be here to talk all about Eve. So any questions you have about Eve that you've been dying to ask, come that night. And Sunday, November 18th, Mark Songhini, who's written a book called The Lost Fleet, which chronicles the true life of the whaling master Thomas Williams and his wife as he struggles to catch whales and avoid the Confederate Navy. Sounds like a sequel to 24, but he'll be here on Sunday, November 18th at 2 p.m. Born in upstate New York, Howard Frank Mosher is a longtime resident of Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, where he lives with his wife Phyllis. He is the author of 10 books, including Waiting for Teddy Williams, The True Account, and The Stranger in the Kingdom, which, along with Disappearances, was co-recipient of the New England Book Award for Fiction. His most recent work is On Kingdom Mountain, and I think there are copies in the library. I haven't bought one. Howard will be, after the talk, be signing as well, I think. Among other honors, Howard has received a Guggenheim Fellowship, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Literature Award, and the New England Book Award. In 2006, he was awarded by the Vermont Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts. There is even a Howard Frank Mosher Short Fiction Prize given by Hunger Mountain, which is the Vermont College Journal of Arts and Letters. And in the fall 2007 issue, you can read the short fiction that won that award. 3 of Howard's novels have been made into feature films by director Jay Craven. And the Los Angeles Times describes Howard Frank Mosher as a combination of Ernest Hemingway, Henry David Thoreau, and Jim Harrison. So please join me in welcoming to the Southeast Kingdom of Vermont, Frank Mosher.
Well, thank you, folks, and thank you for coming tonight. Is the mic working? Can you hear me out there? Okay, good. Well, I've just gotten back to Vermont from like a 100-city-plus book tour, the best part of which, of course, was coming across the Vermont state line a couple of weeks ago. But I had an interesting experience out in Denver. Here where I started the tour. Some of these slides from the Northeast Kingdom, and I had no more than gotten started before a guy came, just blind, staggering, falling down drunk, into the tattered covered bookstore and right down the aisle. And I know what had happened. He had mistaken the bookstore for the very disreputable tavern right next door. And I know that because I met him over there afterward. He talked me into buying him a beer. This guy was really looped, and anybody else in the world would have been embarrassed, but not my friend. He got right up to the slide projector, and I had just started the show, and I think that was the slide that was up on the screen, and he pointed at the screen, and he said, "You, sir, have a very low-tech presentation." And with that, he wheeled around and went staggering back out of the tattered cover to get to that tavern. So, Being from Vermont, I took what he said as a compliment. I have to tell you, I don't think that's exactly how the guy meant it. However, he was right. I do have a very low-tech presentation. The title of the presentation is Where in the World is Kingdom County? And I want to tell you how I came to the Northeast Kingdom in the first place, and then why I stayed. So, where in the world is Kingdom County? I was in fact born in upstate New York. I was born in the Catskill Mountains and moved around from one little mountain and farming community to another. This is Cato Meridian Central High School, where my wife and I both went to high school. And right up here, in this corner room, when we were in 7th and 8th grade, we suffered under the iron fist of the meanest school teacher and probably the meanest human being I have ever known. Her name was Erla Armstrong. And Erla Armstrong absolutely hated kids. She hated all kids right across the board, impartially. And we hated her right back again, and with good reason. And I disliked her so much that when I wrote Northern Borders, my 5th novel, I did a very bad thing. I needed a school teacher, a mean school teacher for Northern Borders. And of course, I immediately thought about Mrs. Erla Armstrong, and I zipped her right into the book as a character. But I really wish I hadn't done this. She's the only real person I know of whose name I haven't changed in a book. So if you want to meet Erla Armstrong in all her glory and know just exactly why we disliked her, try the chapter Down the Coat in Northern Borders. Well, at any rate, it's ironical to me because it was Erla who gave me my first and probably my best piece of advice about writing fiction. She caught me writing a little story in class one day when I should have been doing my homework. And she confiscated it and looked at it and said in a very sneering voice, "Mosher," remember I was all of 12 years old, "Mosher, if you want to write stories, you have to do 3 things. You have to read the classics, you have to revise your work, and you have to write about what you know." And then, running true to form, Mrs. Armstrong ripped my little effort into 100 tiny pieces and threw it in the waste paper basket. But the interesting thing to me is that nobody has ever, in the 50-some years since then, given me any better advice about writing. Read the classics, revise your work, and write about what you know. And how she knew that, I don't know, because she had to be one of the most ignorant persons I've ever met in I shouldn't say that. Erla's long gone. I shouldn't say that to her because she gave me that good advice. Okay, she was right. I wanted to write stories. And I've never wanted to do anything else. I came from a great big farming, storytelling family. Nobody had a penny of money. Everybody had good stories to tell. And I can't remember a time when I did not want to be a story writer. Trouble is, I didn't have a clue in the world how to go at it. Phyllis and I both went to Syracuse University, and she majored in science education, and I had a general English major. And when I got out of Syracuse, I still didn't have a clue for how to write stories. You know, I had 4 years of college English, but I didn't know how to go about doing it. But I thought, someplace out there, if I could find it, there had to be a blueprint that would show me how to write stories somebody else would want to read. And it seemed to me maybe the place to find that blueprint would be graduate school. Little did I know, there's no blueprint, and if there were, graduate school would be the last place in the world to find it. But I was young and naive. So we thought if we taught for a couple of years, save some money, we could go up on to school. And we heard about a couple of jobs in a place called the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. Well, we didn't really know where the Northeast Kingdom was. We certainly didn't know what it was, but Orleans High School, way up in the northern mountains near the Canadian border, needed a science teacher and an English teacher. So on the last day of April, 1964, we borrowed my grandparents' old blue Super 88 Oldsmobile, and we zipped up from central New York State to the Kingdom to interview for those two jobs. And when we left Syracuse, the grass was green, just the way it is in this picture, and the daffodils were poking up, and the trees were putting out leaves, and being Vermonters, you know just exactly where I'm going with this. We got to Burlington, and it was still spring, and then we came up over the Green Mountains and down into the Northeast Kingdom, and that is exactly what we saw. And I know that's what we saw. This pond is not far down the road from our house, and I actually took this picture this last April 30th, so I know that's what we saw. It seemed as though we had somehow gone back one full season into the year from spring to winter. And then, as we continued north toward Orleans and the Canadian border, it began to seem to me that we were working our way back into an earlier era of the 20th century. We passed, logs landed up beside the road and logging horses. And when we got to Lake Willoughby and looked up at that wonderful escarpment up through the gap toward Canada, about 15 miles away, Phyllis glanced up at those cliffs and she said, "My goodness, it looks as though the glacier just came through this place 10 minutes ago." So we knew we had come to a beautiful and special place. We just didn't quite know how special, although we began to get an idea when we hit Orleans, which still to this day, except for the cars, looks like a little Montana railroad town back in the 1880s. It was a Saturday evening, about 6 o'clock, and right between the little brick bank on the left and the railroad tracks were two guys having a fist fight right in the middle of the street. So I can't believe I did this. I can't believe I was ever so young and naive, but I was. I rolled down the car window and I called out, "Excuse me, but could one of you two gentlemen please tell us how to get to the high school?" And the bigger of the two guys, who seemed to be winning the fight, said, "We can do better than that. We can show you how to get there." And uninvited, they piled into the back of Graham and Grant's Oldsmobile, which I must tell you smelled like the Budweiser brewery for 2 weeks after that. And they undertook to get us over to the high school, and that took some time. They directed us down blind alleys and into driveways, and once we wound up in the lumber yard of the Ethan Allen plant, but eventually they got us the 2 blocks over to Orleans High School, which is now the elementary school. I dropped them off on School Street out in front of the high school, and as I turned into the parking lot and looked in my rear view mirror, they had resumed their fist fight in the middle of School Street. So, welcome to Kingdom County. Well, in those days, beginning teachers at Orleans High School earned a whopping $3,900 a year, and we weren't sure, even without kids yet, and with 2 salaries, that we could save enough money on that to go to graduate school, so we were a little skeptical. The superintendent was desperate to find 2 warm bodies to put in the classroom. There had been just a mass exodus of teachers from this school the year before, and he was determined to latch on to these naive kids from upstate New York before we got away. So he sensed that we were a little skeptical about the $3,900, and so he was shrewd. He read us as exactly what we were, country kids. And he said, "Do you two like to fish by any chance?" And we said, "Well, sure." So he said to us, "Let's suspend the interview for a few minutes. I want to show you something." It was just getting toward twilight. And he walked us down to the end of School Street and over to the Willoughby River, which runs right by the north edge of Orleans. And in the dusk, we looked down into a little falls on the Willoughby. And one right after another, we saw these great big 3, 4, 5 pound rainbow trout. We caught it exactly right in the middle of the spring rainbow run up the Willoughby River. And we looked down and watched those magnificent fish leaping the falls. And I looked at Phyllis and she looked at me. And I said to the superintendent, "Where are those teaching contracts?" And that is how, 43 years ago, this last April, Phyllis and Howard Mosher wound up in Orleans, Vermont. And now, I want to tell you why we stayed, and that's a little bit more complicated, although if I had to do it in one sentence, I could. We stayed because what we found in the Northeast Kingdom in the mid-1960s was just a gold mine of stories that nobody else had ever written. So, I have a little montage of images from the kingdom that look pretty much the same today as they did back in the 60s when we arrived. This is Lake Memphremagog, and I was standing in Vermont to take the picture, but looking north up over the Canadian border, which runs just the other side of those 3 islands and cuts right through the lake. The lake then runs for another 20 miles or so up into the mountains and into Quebec. And during the late 1920s and early 30s, that was a great corridor for illicit booze coming down out of Canada. And I've got a story or two about that in a minute. Memphremagog is where about 10 years later I would set a lot of my first novel, Disappearances, the novel that Jay Craven has just made into the good movie. This is the round barn across the road from our house, a couple of miles, and the mountain that stretches up away on the left, the little mountain, probably about the size of the mountain right across the Connecticut from Brattleboro, is the ridge I had in mind for Kingdom Mountain in my new book on Kingdom Mountain, and I will get to that in a minute too. Now, if I put these slides in the right order last night, the next image is one that you don't see quite so frequently on the Vermont Life annual calendar, but it also is one of the aspects of the Northeast Kingdom that makes it an interesting place for somebody like me to write about. There are a few people, and I guess I might be one of them, who wish that the little town of Irisburg, where I live, had at least 1 or 2 zoning regulations. On the other hand, if you've read my Boston Red Sox novel, Waiting for Teddy Williams, you will recognize the inspiration for Devil Dan's Midnight Auto junkyard. And so this image, too, is a part of the Northeast Kingdom. This is the house where Phyllis and I first lived in Orleans. We rented a little cramped 3-room apartment in the upstairs of this house. And I'd like to tell you about 3 of my early Northeast Kingdom mentors. I think in some ways the Northeast Kingdom became my graduate school, although it didn't happen all at once. And if so, my first literary mentor, storytelling mentor, was our first landlady. A couple of weeks after we arrived in Orleans, she invited us down to her downstairs apartment, and she told us a story. She said that during the Depression, she and her husband had a small farm near the Canadian border. And like so many farms in that era, it was going under. They just couldn't make enough from their milk check from 6 or 8 cows to keep ahead of their bank payments, and they were just a half step away from losing that farm, which was all they had. Well, they had 7 children, and our landlady made up her mind there was no way that they were going to lose that place. So she decided that she would put to use the only skill her father had ever taught her, and that was making moonshine. There's not much left of her farm today. Most of it's grown up to woods, but there's a little field, and down in the corner of this field, just the other side of those evergreen trees, our landlady set up a still. She deplored anything that had to do with, alcohol, the consumption of alcohol, the manufacture of alcohol, but she wasn't going to lose that farm. So she ran off just enough shine to keep their place afloat during those hard years. And one night, as she was working at the still by lantern light, she looked up, and across a little brook, she saw what she described as a pair of city shoes with a guy wearing a city suit standing in them. And she knew right away who he was. He was a revenue agent. So she thought fast, and she said to him, "You can arrest me if you want to, but I want you to know that if you do, we're going to lose our place." And when she looked up again, the man was gone. Well, they held on to the farm. They put each one of those 7 kids through high school and college. And then suddenly her husband died. And our landlady sold the place and moved into Orleans. And some years before Phyllis and I arrived, there was a knock at her door one evening. She recognized the guy standing there in the city shoes and the city suit. And she said to him, "Have you come to arrest me again?" And he said to her, "No, ma'am, this time I've come to marry you." And he did. And they were very happy together, just as she had been with her first husband. But then a couple of years later, he developed health problems and died suddenly. And when she finished telling us this story, she thought for a minute, and then she smiled. And I can see her smiling right now. She had a very, very kind face, and she lived a hard, tough life, but she was a kind person. She became a kind of a surrogate mom to us that first year in Orleans. She smiled, and she said, without one speck of self-pity, I have had a very good life. Nothing at all to complain about, but I reckon I just ain't had good luck keeping my husbands alive. And when she said that, once again, I looked at Phyllis, and Phyllis looked at me, and this time we both knew that I was going to write stories about this special kingdom up in northern Vermont. But I still didn't have a clue how it was done. I bet I wrote our landlady's story through, over the next 4 or 5 years, 100 times. I just couldn't seem to get it right. I couldn't seem to get any of my stories right. What Mrs. Armstrong didn't tell me is that, yeah, read the classics and revise your work and write about what you know, but she didn't say anything about that long, long apprenticeship that every writer has to struggle through before you begin to get any idea at all how to write a story. I was in the middle of the apprenticeship, but being young, being foolish, thinking that there was a blueprint out there and a shortcut to all this, I applied for a fellowship at the University of California at Irvine, right out in Southern California, of all places. They had a brand new Master of Fine Arts program in fiction writing, and wonder of wonders, I got accepted. And we hated to leave the kingdom, but in late summer of 1969, we went whooping out to California, And we hadn't been there 2 days before I hated it more than any other place on the face of the earth, which I pretty much still do, I have to tell you. Every time I go back there on a book tour, I think about, you know, me 30-some years ago stuck out there. I didn't like California, and I think what I disliked about it most was it wasn't the Northeast Kingdom. You know, I was right in the middle of that apprenticeship, and I was just beginning to learn enough about the kingdom to write about it a little bit, and suddenly I made the mistake of my life by cutting myself right off from that material. So Phyllis said, let's go for a ride and get some perspective on this. So we pointed the car in any old direction, and I remember seeing a lot of scenes like that. That's right there is why I hated California. Where would you catch a brook trout within 100 miles of there? And we found ourselves by total coincidence in the least inspiring place on the face of the earth, the intersection of Hollywood and Vine, right in downtown Los Angeles. There we were. And I've always wondered what would have happened if the traffic light had been green as we approached the intersection, but it wasn't. It was red. We stopped. A telephone truck pulled up beside us, and the driver must have seen our green Vermont license plate because he rolled his window down quickly and he shouted out, "I'm from Vermont too. Go back while you still can." So there was a message from above. Right? So we did, after 1 week in California, right on the spot. And when we got back, I had a stroke of enormous good luck. And that's all it was. It was just sheer good luck. I heard about a guy, an old logger named Jake Blodgett, who still worked with a logging horse in the woods up near the Canadian border. And somebody told me that he was a rough old guy and to be careful around him, but he needed a helper. Well, I thought to myself, this would be an experience that I would not have teaching Robert Frost, the high school kids. So I went out to see Jake. The following Sunday afternoon, when I thought he'd be home, this guy lived in a one-room shack with his housekeeper and his logging horse right up in the middle of the woods. All three of them lived right in this little shack. And I would give anything in the world if I had a picture to show you of Jake Blodgett, but it never occurred to me to take one at a time. And then, of course, he was gone. I do have a picture of his logging horse. Anyway, I went up and I knocked on the door, and he came to the door and looked out at me. He was a big guy with snowy white hair and just piercingly blue eyes, which he fixed right on me. And I told him I heard he needed a helper, and he said, "Maybe," as though it were two words, maybe. And then he said, "What have you done for work before?" And I said, I had to admit to him, I'd been a teacher, and it didn't impress him. He said, "Well, school teacher, that ain't going to help you up in the woods with me. What would you want for pay?" So I said to him, "Well, Mr. Blodgett, I've never done this kind of work before, but if you'll give me a shot at this, try me out for 2 or 3 days, you can pay me what you think I'm worth." And instantly he said, "School teacher, that would not be much." And it wasn't. He was right. But bless Jake's good heart, he took me on, and I worked with him all the fall of 1969 and on into that winter. My job, as only Jake could have put it, was to run the horse. The horse was 22 years old, and he wasn't thrilled about working in the woods at that age. So Jake was cutting evergreen trees like the ones in the background of that picture, and he would cut them and limb them out, and then my job was to hitch a couple of those tree-length logs on behind the horse and lead the horse down out of the woods, cut up the logs into 4-foot pulp sticks, and stack them up for the trucks to come in and pick up when the ground froze. And all that fall, every time I turned my back on that horse, for as much as 10 seconds, Jake would laugh and say, "School teacher," it's all he called me for 2 months, "School teacher, your horse has run off on you again." And then he would say, trying not to laugh, "Go fetch it back." So the horse would start to angle off toward Jake's shack half a mile away down in the woods, and I would start after it. And that logging horse was a lot smarter than the young school teacher. If I walked to catch up with it, the horse would walk, and he'd keep an interval of about 50 feet between us. But if I started to trot, the horse would trot, putting a little more distance between us, and if I ran to catch that guy, he would break into a flat-out gallop, and I bet I chased him down to Jake's shack that first month or so 20 times, always to Jake's great amusement. But over our lunches up in the woods, and after Jake and I got to be friends and began going fishing and hunting together, he told me many of the stories from his days as a Prohibition-era whiskey runner that found their way into disappearances, and he became the inspiration for the crusty old logger Noel Lord in my short novel Where the Rivers Flow North. And best of all, and this of course is why I would love a photograph of him, when our son was born in 1972, we named him after Jake. So we have a son named Jake. One of the best stories Jake told me is an anecdote that I have tried to work into almost every Northeast Kingdom story I've written, and I just can't make it fit. It will not seem to fit. It just hangs up in the air in the middle of nowhere, and eventually I have to say to myself, I'll use it in my next book. But it's an interesting story. It's revealing about Jake. During Prohibition, Jake bought himself an old Packard. And 2 or 3 times a month, he would take that up to Sherbrooke or Montreal, and he'd buy a load of Canadian booze, run it back down over the mainly unwatched network of back roads between Vermont and Quebec, and take it down to Burlington or Montpelier and sell it at a good profit. Well, one night as he was coming down this back road, which is in between Coventry and Irisburg, where we live, in that old Packard, with a carload of revenuers not very far behind him, you know, lights flashing and sirens screaming, he missed the curve just shy of this little covered bridge, and he found himself sitting in the Packard right down the middle of the Black River. Well, the revenuers came around the first curve, and not knowing Jake had missed the turn, they went across the bridge and down the road, and they came back, turned around, went across the bridge again, came back again, and after a while they gave up and went away. So when Jake told me this story, he brought me over here to the bridge. And I said to him, "Jake, what did you do down there in the car while the revenuers were going back and forth across the bridge?" And he shrugged very philosophically, and he said, "Well, I just drinked me a fifth of that good Canadian Seagram's." And at dawn, Jake went up to the little farm across the bridge, and he bribed the farmer with a fifth of that Seagram's to come down and yank him out of the river with his team of horses. And I think that they must have made cars better in those days than they do today, because Jake told me that he took the Packard up to the barn and dried it out that day, and then that night he took whatever part of the load wasn't broken on down to Barrie and sold it. And do you think I can get that in one of my stories? You'd think it would have to fit in disappearances, but that doesn't seem to be the way books write. This is our third Northeast Kingdom mentor, our landlady Jake, and our probably oldest and maybe closest friend in the Northeast Kingdom, Marjorie Moore, who is 89 or 90 and still owns a little very hard scrabble farm up in Brownington, right in the middle of the Northeast Kingdom. Marjorie is I would say, more than half Native American. I think Abnaki and Cognac from up near Montreal. And Margie has told me over the years, literally hundreds of stories that in one way or another, and probably ways I'm not even aware of, have worked their way into my books. Margie is not a favorite with the local constabulary. You know, she's like Jake. She never really broke any serious laws, but like a lot of Northeast Kingdom folks, she lives out on the edge and might have to shoot a deer once in a while to get through the winter. So far as I know, she's never bothered to purchase a Vermont driver's license. And for years and years, the police would stop her and they would ticket her for driving without a license. Margie, who has a world-class sense of humor, kept in her glove compartment a little book of citations that she had printed up. And while the officer was writing a ticket to Marjorie for driving without a license, she would cite him in her book for driving without a license on ancestral Abnaki land and then give him the ticket. And then that would, of course, enrage the officer, and into court they would go, and almost invariably, it didn't matter who the judge was, he'd get laughing so hard that he'd just throw the case right out of court. I once heard him say to a poor young state trooper who, after all, was only doing his job, "Young man, don't you ever bring this good woman back into my courtroom again on these petty-ante charges." Well, in the early 1970s, that little brick bank in Orleans was robbed 3 or 4 times in a period of maybe 2 years. They never caught the bank robbers. I always thought it was maybe guys coming down out of Canada, hitting the bank, getting whatever you could get out of it in those days. What would that be? $2,000 back up to Canada. But I don't know. The police, however, made a leap of logic that I could never follow. They decided that Marjorie Moore, who has, when it comes to money, like Abraham Lincoln type honesty, that Marjorie Moore had masterminded the bank robberies. So this is one of these only in the Northeast Kingdom stories, and it's a story that in 2 or 3 of my novels, I sort of incorporated bits and pieces of this. The police began to pester Marjorie. They would show up at her farm in the middle of the night and question her about the bank robbery. And that irritated Marge, and so she decided to exact revenge on the police. She hinted to a near neighbor, a notorious gossip, that maybe she did know something about those bank robberies after all, and just maybe the loot was buried out behind her barn under a towering manure pile that Margie had wanted moved for these many years. So only in Kingdom County would the cops show up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a backhoe, with a bulldozer. But they did, and suffice it to say, Margie got her manure pile moved, and what they found at the bottom of it was what you usually find at the bottom of a manure pile, and nothing more. So there we have our dear friend Marjorie. People were always asking me, where is this village of Kingdom Common that you write about so much? So I tell my neighbors where it is. Kingdom Common is a combination of 3 Northeast Kingdom villages with an awful lot of invention thrown in. And the 3 villages are the little village of Irisburg, where we live, and Orleans with the bank and the railroad tracks, and Newport with the courthouse, and then just a whole lot of invention. And my neighbors understand this, and they nod and accept it, but every once in a while, one of them will scratch his head and say, "Yes, but where can we go and see the village of Kingdom Common?" This is my beloved wife Phyllis of 43 years with her friend Perry the Talking Macaw, which lives at the local hardware store in Newport, if you've read Waiting for Teddy Williams, you'll recognize the inspiration for the talking macaw that belongs to the Boston Red Sox manager in Waiting for Teddy Williams. That macaw is named the Curse of the Bambino, and it sits on the manager's shoulder during each and every game and repeatedly says, "New York Yankees #1, New York Yankees #1. Not no more, right? Everybody has seen on the first or second page of most novels, usually right up front, the disclaimer that the characters are not based on real people. You will never see that disclaimer in a book by Howard Mosher for the simple reason that I think that's the biggest fib in the history of the world. Who else would the characters be based on if they weren't based on real people? Of course they're based on real people. Now, sometimes in my stories, characters they're like my little village of Kingdom Come, and they're an amalgamation of 2 or 3 different people, again, with invention thrown in, probably with parts of myself thrown in. But I know of at least 6 characters in my stories I based directly on Phyllis, including Athena Allen and A Stranger in the Kingdom, and Yellow Sage Flower, who tells wise stories, the Blackfoot Woman, and the Lewis and Clark spoof, the true account. And Phyllis claimed the other day that she can actually detect bits and pieces of herself in Miss Jane Hubble Kinnison, the heroine of On Kingdom Mountain. So that brings me to the new book on Kingdom Mountain. And I'm fascinated by what inspires novels, and sometimes because writing fiction is ultimately a pretty mysterious process, it's hard to say what inspired a book. But I remember when I got the inkling of an idea for the new book on Kingdom Mountain. I was walking here on the mountain just across the road from our house up in Irisburg. Technically it's Lowell Mountain. It's not very big. It's maybe 2,000 feet high at most, and it runs for 15 or 18 miles from Coventry in the north down past Albany in the south. And this is the place that I really like better than any other place on the face of the earth. And I try to walk or cross-country ski or fish up here or hunt 3 or 4 times a week. I was walking up here back in, might have been the fall of 2000, and a terrible image went through my mind. It just flashed through my head of the whole side of that mountain developed with Walmarts and McDonald's and strip malls, and it was gone almost as soon as it came, but it was an unsettling image. And I'd been thinking for several weeks at the time about my great Aunt Jane, and she was a stern matriarchal figure in the Mosher family. She was my grandfather's sister, unmarried lady who had been a school teacher, and you know, as a kid I didn't really know enough to appreciate her. And she was stern. She would check my report card, you know, letter grade by letter grade, and it had better be up to her standards or else. But she also read me Dickens, read me Shakespeare, read me Mark Twain. And I didn't really know enough to appreciate her, but I'd been thinking what a good character she would make in a novel. And all of a sudden, I asked myself a question. And novelists are always asking this question. Usually it doesn't amount to a hill of beans, but this time it did. I asked myself, what if a woman like my stern old great Aunt Jane, who was also beyond eccentric, owned a mountain like our little mountain back in her era, the early 1930s, and that mountain were in danger of being developed by a group of local business people who wanted to shove a road up over it and force Miss Jane off the mountain and build Vermont's first ski resort on the mountain. So I picked the mountain up and I moved it 15 miles north to the Canadian border, and I kind of swiveled it around at right angles to give it a little bit of distinctiveness, and put Miss Jane up there. And that was the inspiration for the novel, and 5 long, hard years later, the novel was finished. In some ways, I think that I'm still serving that long apprenticeship, and when I begin a new novel all over again, I know that I'm still serving it. I want to finish up by talking a little bit about the glamour in the writing life, and I have to say, now having pursued it hard for 35 years or so, that writing fiction is like any other work that you love. Doesn't matter what the work is, and it doesn't matter whether it pays well or doesn't pay well, easy or hard. If you love it, and if you bring passion to it, you aren't going to regret doing that one bit. But I have to tell you, I have yet to discover the glamour in the writing life, and I want to start with the process of seeing a book that you've written made into a movie. This is a picture I took of the filming of Disappearances, Jay Craven's latest movie. That's Chris Christopherson over on the left, and these guys are standing around waiting for the runaway train scene, which was filmed up in northern New Hampshire a couple of years ago. And to me, that's what movie making is all about, standing around and waiting. And then, you know, after they stood there for a day and a half, they got on the train and they filmed that scene for 45 seconds, and that was that. And then number 2, I think movie making consists of more standing around and waiting. And here we have Snowflake, the trained great snowy owl, standing on the stone wall and waiting for his wonderful moment in the sun. So nothing really glamorous about the movie making business. I was afraid that Snowflake, who did not have a tether, was going to go winging off over the Canadian border and never be seen again. And in fact, he did go down into that little patch of woods on the left and get lost for a few minutes. But he didn't have a tether, but he had an electronic tracking device around his foot. So his handler was able to go down and find him. But glamour in the movie making business, I don't think so. It's just a lot of hard work and a lot of standing around. And then if you are lucky and live in Irisburg, your movies will wind up at Nancy's Video, just up the street from where we live, a few short miles. And apropos of the glamour in the movie making business, the last time I went into Nancy's and checked, I kid you not, I found Jay Craven's films of Where the Rivers Flow North, A Stranger in the Kingdom, and Disappearances way in the back, tucked in between Die Hard 1 and Death Wish 3. So much for the glamour in the movie making business. I like Jay Craven's films very much. No glamour though. However, I had a near glamorous experience 3 years ago out on the West Coast when I was doing my book tour for Waiting for Teddy Williams. This is the closest I've come in 35 years. My motel, my little Motel 6, was just up the street from the bookstore where I was appearing that evening in Portland, Oregon. And in between the motel and the bookstore was one of those truly horrible little concrete block strip joints with bars over the windows. And I'm sure that at 10 o'clock, when Miss Ty Fire went on at the strip joint with her act Fireotica, that she gave a very glamorous performance. Because the parking lot of the strip joint at 7 o'clock, when I went on at the bookstore next door, was overflowing. The bookstore that night was not. There were 2 people in attendance. One was the clueless writer from northern Vermont. The other was the proprietor, right, of the bookstore. And he was in a white heat to get next door and see the glamorous So how about the Great American Book Tour? Well, it's wonderful to go to libraries and bookstores and thank the people who keep me in business, and I do thank you from the bottom of my heart. But the Great American Book Tour isn't all it's cracked up to be. I got to tell you, until this summer, when I conned my publisher into renting a brand new little red Kia that was all kinds of fun to drive around the country, I conducted many of my cross-country book tours in our old 1987 Chevy Celebrity, which my wife's junior high science students are pleased to call the loser cruiser. we know why, don't we? And the loser cruiser turned something like 200,000 miles in Seattle, Washington 3 years ago, so we retired it to the local demolition derby. But when I got back from the big book tour for Waiting for Hetty Williams, I did have a semi-glamorous experience. I think the first of, and perhaps the only one of my writing life. So I want to tell you about it. My publisher finally did something that I've been begging them to do for 10 years. They own or rent or lease, however it works, 16 box seats at Fenway Park, right up behind third base. And for years I have begged them to let Phyllis and me come down and watch a Red Sox game in one of their precious seats. And finally, I think, feeling sorry for me because I had the tour around the country in the loser cruiser, they, in 2004, invited us down to Boston to sit in those box seats and watch a Red Sox game. And they did something else. They put us up at the Four Seasons Inn in downtown Boston. Now, you've probably gathered at this point that Phyllis and Howard Mosher are not really your typical Four Seasons guests. And so Phyllis was appropriately dressed, but please imagine, again, the clueless author in his Northeast Kingdom hunting jacket and 20-year-old Red Sox cap pulled down over his eyes, hunkered down behind the wheel of the loser cruiser, pulling up to the pillared portico of the Four Seasons Inn in downtown Boston. The doorman took one horrified look at this apparition, and he came at a dead run, waving his arms and shouting, "Sir, sir, in order to stay at the Four Seasons, you need a..." And before he could say reservation, I said, "Oh, sir, I'm sure if you'll check, you'll find we have one." Well, he had a little handheld electronic device, somewhat like the slide clicker, with a screen on it. And he could tell from punching up our names whether we had reservations at the Four Seasons or not. And I was just praying that my publisher had got it right. They did. And only rarely have I seen a more shocked and disappointed expression on a man's face. And back to the glamour of the writing life, the very next evening, in the parking lot of the Motel 6 in Portland, Maine, the gas tank fell off the loser cruiser. And I had to hitchhike to my book event in downtown Portland. So there endeth the story of the glamour in the writing life. Another low-tech slide. Phyllis suggested we take this of the writer standing by some of the manuscripts that I churned out for an earlier book. I think maybe the true account. I like to write my early drafts by hand on yellow legal tablets. I've always done it that way, and it's tradition, but also I think it keeps me going slowly on the first drafts, and that's fairly important because you don't want to get too far out ahead of yourself. And then for later drafts, I have a great typist who has typed up each one of my books. But what do? And I'm going to use disappearances as an example. When you work night and day on a novel for years on end, and I remember a couple of weeks after Disappearances was published, it was my first novel. I was in that euphoric state of a writer who's worked for years, and finally here's a book between two hardcovers. I walked up to the Irisburg post office, and right there in our postal box was a copy of the book review section from a renowned North American newspaper whose name will never, ever pass my lips again. But I was very excited. You know, here was my first novel reviewed right on the front page of this fabled old newspaper. And there was the jacket art from Disappearances and my name and the title of the book, Disappearances. And I was as happy as a clam until my eyes traveled up to the headline of the review, which read, and I quote, "Vermont writer should disappear." And I'm very sorry to report that that was the positive part of the review. And it ran sharply downhill from that point forward. So, here off-key. Judge Allen, who had been an infantry major in the Great War, said he would forsake the piano for once and go up to the off-limits balcony and sit with the boys. That, he assured Jane, would end their insurrection. Over her dead body, said she, Jane Hubble-Kinnison had never had to call in reinforcements before, and she didn't intend to now. On the Friday evening after the flood, armed with her redoubtable scrub broom, she descended from the projection booth just before the movies began, as the Dalton James boys were stomping and cheering and catcalling and chanting, "Start the show," and laid about right and left as vigorously as Friar Tuck with his quarterstaff. But the boys were as agile as young bobcats and very nearly as feral, and they dodged and ducked and dived under the cracked wooden seats. Miss Jane could make no headway with them at all. Then came the letter from the town father suggesting that the Duchess, that's what Miss Jane is called in the village, the Duchess of Kingdom Mountain. The Duchess had more than fulfilled her civic duties over the years, and it might be time to graciously step aside for a younger projectionist. Their true purpose, of course, was to hector her into agreeing to the highway. They hinted that if she wished to sit down and talk with them about the connector, that's what they call the highway, they might assign the high sheriff to police duty at the town hall movies, thereby enabling her to stay on. "Be at this coming Friday night's show," Miss Jane tersely replied by return mail. Word immediately spread throughout the common that something momentous was going to happen at the town hall the following Friday evening. A huge crowd turned out for The Perils of Pauline, and the Dalton James boys rose to the occasion. There were screeching catcalls, squealing pig calls, boys jumping out of their seats to pepper the villain and hero alike with spitwads, boys spilling out of the balcony, pelting up and down the aisles, and generally holding Bartholomew Fair while the patrons tried in vain to watch the movie. "Here now," George Quinn said to them once. Judge Allen would undoubtedly have intervened, but he was in Burlington where his first grandchild had just been born. When Black Bart appeared on the screen, twirling his oily mustachios, the Dalton James boys erupted, cheering, stomping, clapping, and exhorting the villain as he roped Pauline to the railroad tracks. That's when the frame froze on the screen. Forth from the projection booth issued the Duchess to a storm of hooting jeers. She proceeded down from the balcony, along the faded carpet on the stairs, past the frayed purple rope, past the ticket counter. Without breaking stride, she switched on the house lights and started down the center aisle in her long black motoring coat, which resembled a cowboy's duster. Someone sang out, and then along came Jane. Others joined in, long, tall Jane. It was the hero's refrain from The Perils of Pauline. Popcorn and spitballs and hard candy poured down from above. The refrain rose to a thundering crescendo as Miss Jane walked up the steps to the stage, head held high, as stately as a condemned queen walking to her own execution. Slow walking Jane, slow talking Jane, roared the hall. Henry, unable to bear another moment of this, rose to go conduct her off the stage and home. Then, in one motion, Jane Hubble-Kinnison of Kingdom Mountain swept open her duster, produced Lady Justice, that is her father's Civil War rifle, jacked a shell into the chamber, swung around, and firing from the hip, put a fist-sized hole through the heart of Black Bart on the screen. The roar of the gunshot reverberated in the old town hall. Later it would be ascertained that the slug had passed through the back brick wall of the building and lodged in the trunk of an elm at the foot of Anderson Hill. Jane wheeled around to face the stunned audience as acrid smoke twisted out of the end of the rifle. She twirled Lady Justice half a revolution by its lever and tucked it barrel up inside her duster. Then, in the total silence that had fallen over the hall, she walked back up the aisle, past the ticket counter, past the purple rope, up the stairs to the balcony, and calmly finished showing the movie. And that, folks, is Miss Jane Hubble-Kinnison of Kingdom Mountain. It's already 10 minutes after my allotted hour. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much. I would be glad to sign some books.
Had it already been around the back?
Yes, we got switch tapes on.